Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending Talent Quest's webinar on building an effective high-potential management program. My name is Dina Kwasik, and I am a member of the communications team here at Talent Quest. We're really excited to spend the next hour discussing how to identify and manage high-value potentials. After the presentation, we will have time for a brief question and answer session. Please send your questions via the questions box that appears at the top right of your screen. Also, after the webinar, we will forward a copy of the presentation as well as a recording to everybody. So let's get started. Our presenter today is Brandon Heck, a talent management consultant here at Talent Quest. Brandon is one of our licensed psychologists who specializes in executive assessments and coaching. He has some great information to share with you today, so I'd like to welcome Brandon and turn the presentation over to him. Welcome, Brandon. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Dina, and thank all of you for joining us. As you know by signing up, today's discussion will be about high potential programs, and we've got a lot to cover in a fairly short period of time, and I don't want to belabor too many issues, so I'm going to move forward, and let's just remind ourselves of what today's objectives are. What I'd like to start out with is just a basic understanding, and some of you probably already possess a much more knowledgeable understanding than I'll provide of what a high potential employee is, and also what it is not. And that's a common tripping point where folks may misidentify or look to the wrong identification factors. So we need to clear those up front. Also, discussing the things that need to be thought about and or decided before putting a high potential program in place. So we'll cover some of those concerns and considerations as we move forward. Secondly, or thirdly, there is identifying ways of assessing and pulling out those high potential employees from your group at large, reviewing the what's and how's of how to develop those folks once you have a grouping of them, and then begin thinking at a broader scale of how to implement a program around these folks that's not only going to be effective, but also garner the greatest usage and buy-in from those you work with. So starting out, let's discuss what a high potential employee is. And one simple way of thinking about this and what you're looking for has been described by some as the can do, the will do, and the want to. Can do, as you can see on the screen, referring to an individual's capability. So that may pertain to competencies or skills, but just that capacity to be able to conduct what is being asked of them or would be asked of them in the potential role. The will do or commitment refers to things like passion, an individual's drive or motivation to engage in that activity or role. And then the want to or alignment, which is as straightforward as it seems, connectedness to the strategic mission, an agreement with the vision of the company, and the desire to kind of push forward on that. Thinking about it in terms of, we often use the on the bus analogy. The can do would be if we position someone in a window seat, can they physically operate that window? The will do or the commitment, are they someone who's going to do that when asked? And then alignment, are they someone who's going to do that without being asked? Are they someone who enjoys doing that for the sake of everyone else on the bus? What a high potential employee isn't is an important topic of discussion because it's often a confusing one for many. What they're not is they're not necessarily high performers. And oftentimes those two categories of folks seem almost one and the same to many. High performers, folks who are doing well at what they are currently tasked with, are not necessarily high potentials. Think about it in terms of the bus analogy we just used. You may have someone who's doing great putting that window up and down for everyone, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're suited or capable of driving the bus. On the flip side, while high potentials are often high performers, that's not always 100%. Again, sticking with this analogy and getting some mileage out of it, there may be folks who are just better suited or more interested in driving the bus than putting the window up and down, and so are not doing that as well as others. One theme we will expound upon throughout this discussion is the idea that past performance does not necessarily equal future performance, and that's something that is often overlooked and can lead to pitfalls within this area. Performance is certainly a useful consideration, and I think it's one that should not just be thrown out. But the idea that someone who has done well is the person who is positioned best to do well in the future in any given role is going to lead you to miss the point on this. And so I think as we go forward, we will continue to touch upon this point and maybe build upon it into a useful understanding of the connection between performance and potential. To start that discussion of the interface between performance and potential, I'm putting up here a pretty typically and pretty well-known visualization aid called a 9-box. And as you can see, it varies in terms of an individual's performance on the bottom, the x-axis, ranging from low to high. Performance being one of those things that all of us are typically familiar with how to assess, and something that most organizations do fairly consistently and with some reasonable level of objectivity. Potential on the y-axis, going up and down, ranging from low to high, is one that is oftentimes not thought about as clearly. And it's because it's harder to think about. Unless you've really thought through how and what you're aiming for, it can be difficult to really quantify or even assess in any general way an individual's ranking on that scale. As you can see, those two factors are separate but interrelated in some ways. And looking at this 9-box, I'm not going to read through all the areas, but you can tell that it ranges from folks who are poor performers and have poor potential and being a risk to the organization, to those who are doing well in their current role and have the potential to do well as they progress into other roles, who are more likely to be greater assets to the organization over the long run. The question for many is, why should we really spend the time investing in these individuals, identifying and investing in these individuals? Why not just spend time investing in people as a whole? I will tell you, it largely traces back to the issue of retention and succession. There's a recent Society for Human Resources Talent Management survey report which indicated that the number one challenge for organizations today is building a deeper reservoir of successors. And one of the obstacles is that most organizations extract leadership talent from their individual contributor ranks. So folks who are already within the organization, who are performing somewhat in a reactive or individual contributor fashion, and then are progressed to a leadership role over time, which obviously is different from what their initial tasking was. So again, with the question of why not just focus on everyone and hope that we can touch and retain the people who are going to do well, for most of us, resources are limited: time, money, energy, and so it becomes important to invest wisely. The way to invest wisely in this regard is through demarcation or identifying or separating individuals into kind of somewhat of a pretty clear category structure. Some refer to it as A, B, C players. There are other maybe more subtle ways to refer to things. But it's important to do this so that you can make more strategic and resourceful HR decisions around these folks and allocate things wisely. It's somewhat akin to picking stocks. If you were to just look at the performance of an index as a whole and just say, I'm going to throw money in general at that, that's one way to go about it. If things were a little bit tighter, you might want to do a little bit of research to identify what are A-level stocks that I have a lot of confidence in, not just what they're doing now, but what their potential is over time. What are those B-level ones that may make sense to put some investment in, and what are the ones I want to stay away from or reallocate my resources? So great organizations tend to distribute the investments they make into their people and according to their potential. And so that's the importance of doing this at this point. As we start talking about the whys, assuming that folks have bought in and you and the team have bought in and decide that it's important to make strategic investments in the right places, setting up a high potential program for success requires some pretty clear front-end thinking. And the first thing that needs to be thought about is potential and what we're referring to with regards to your organization or needs. It's important that high potential programs not just be generic descriptors of some sort of development program for some ambiguous position in the long run. It needs to be specific. And that really requires that an organization isolate and identify and define their desired future state Think about the position requirements and the competencies necessary to get to that place. And so that in some regards, you have a target to aim for. The second thing that's necessary at the front end to set up a program for success is definitely getting executive buy-in. While these programs are often driven at an HR level and affect mainly those below, it's important that this not just be a isolated activity. This needs to be part of the cultural mindset and organizational mission. Roland Smith, who's a lead researcher at the Center for Creative Leadership, says, and I quote, "When we look at organizations who are best in class in identification, selection, and development of high potentials, the senior-most executives are directly involved and understand it's a key responsibility. Where it's not as successful, development of high potential talent is not as important to the CEO." So starting at the top, we know that effective high potential programs are less about checking the box and more about operating in accordance with a shared mindset. And all of us know from our own experiences, the tone for that and the direction on those kind of things definitely needs to come from above. The third consideration for planning a program or beginning to think about how to target high potentials in your company is making sure you're targeting the right size group. According to a 2014 research article that I reviewed in advance of this, one of the quotes was that the strongest level of employee engagement and high potential retention was when 15 to 30% of employees were categorized and developed accordingly. Later in this talk, I'll reference a statistic and a quote from McDonald's, who does do a lot of high potential development, and they target 25% of their folks. If you read elsewhere, though, others would argue that the band needs to be restricted and maybe a little tighter in the 5 to 10% range. What I would say is that, like most things in business, and certainly in my area of dealing with people issues and kind of considerations that vary, it's going to depend on the context. And so I think your organization needs to guide this decision based on a consideration of anticipated needs and or opportunities for the folks that you're going to be developing, so they don't just get bottlenecked in some sort of high potential purgatory. Company specific staffing and structure considerations, and the resources, the money and the time that's going to be available for development efforts, so you don't recruit more than you can develop. Another big issue at the front end that needs to be discussed or considered is the question of to tell or not to tell, which is not very clearly answered within the literature. There are camps who would say that it's important to clearly identify those who are high potential within the organization. Some of them base this on the argument that without providing an accurate assessment of where people fall, folks are apt to maybe overinflate their sense of what's expected for themselves or their own abilities. There's a statistic I read that 90% of managers think they're among the top percent of performers. And for folks like that, when the future fails to deliver on the upward trajectory that they were expecting, some can suffer wounded egos and potentially leave. So in some ways, those who say tell are saying let's manage expectations and set objectives here. Another reason for the folks to advocate telling and clearly defining what group a person's in is to provide those who are in the high potential camp some visibility and maybe even encouragement to stick around so that they know that they are being invested in and have a future opportunity. One study from the Center for Creative Leadership indicated that of those high potential individuals who were not told of their status, 33% were looking for another job. Of those who were told, only 14% were looking. So obviously some effect that may need to be considered in that regard. Those on the side of not telling oftentimes revert to a consideration of what is kind of falls within the realm of fixed versus malleable mindset, and that could be a whole nother talk in and of its own. But suffice it to say, it's a situation where if folks are told or labeled as a certain thing, then they oftentimes expect or just assume that they are going to be carried forward on the virtue of that label, versus being kind of maintaining that mindset that my lot in life, and my lot in this company is determined by effort and the such. Example with my son, I have a 6-year-old who I'm very conscious. He's a smart boy, and I definitely tell him that on occasion, but I'm much more conscious to reward him for the effort he puts forward. I don't necessarily want him just thinking he's smart and therefore can float through on things. And so those in the do not tell camp would say, let's not call someone a high potential and make them either have an inflated sense of ego or decrease their reliance on work. Let's just keep all things equal in terms of our communication to all. So certainly some considerations on either side. Some, again, in the do not tell might say that you're going to demotivate those who are not in that grouping. So what's the answer to this? Again, I think this lies within your company. I think contextual considerations, historical factors, just the nature of your culture is going to dictate a lot of what the appropriate way is to go. One thing I'll say is I don't know that it's an either or scenario. There's a 2013 book on high potential assessment by Lisa Steindler, who surveyed 15 senior HR leaders for prominent companies within the US and UK and France. She found that 75% did not officially communicate high potential status to their folks. And it wasn't just because they didn't have a high potential program. In fact, 75% of that group did have special training and leadership development programs for that population. So while they didn't communicate status officially, they still let them know in certain ways and maybe let them know more through action by providing the training and development they need. So in some ways, there may be a way of not officially speaking to it, but rewarding that effort and showing those who work hard and are striving towards greater things that they will be rewarded in like fashion. Continuing on with the front-end planning, one thing to recognize is that the gate needs to swing both ways. The folks can both be invited in or given the opportunity to take part in the developmental opportunities of the high potential program, as well as return to those who are not, to the grouping of those who are not in it. And again, the example here is the McDonald's reference I made earlier, where high potentials constitute approximately 20 to 25% of the employee population at any given time. But they're very clear that that list is always subject to change based on changes in performance or leadership traits or alignment, commitment, and the like. That being said, it's important to recognize that you really should avoid making hasty changes on the basis of individual year performance in terms of who's a high potential and who's not. Sometimes challenges like those experienced on a year-to-year basis can provide a great assessment and can be a development tool in and of themselves. And for instance, Rich Flourish, who's the Executive Vice President and Chief of HR Operations at McDonald's, quotes, individual year performance should not drive a change in potential because some of the challenges that arise may actually be some of the best learning experiences. Somebody going through tough patches might actually come out stronger. So again, while the gate needs to swing both ways, there needs to be some mindful operation in who you invite in and how quickly you push out. And then the last point to consider is this is not an all or nothing. This is not we either do high potential for every position that we may need or we don't do anything. Reality is often the dictator of what can be done initially. And so if resources are limited, whether that's money or time or personnel to really manage and caretake these programs, what I would recommend is looking for those positions that are going to be the most necessary, most critical, or the biggest gap in terms of what's available to fill in the ranks, and focus there and then build out from that position. So once those have been thought through, then the pedal needs to be pushed and things need to be moved forward. And the first step is identifying those who are high potentials within your organization, which is no simple task. Most of the research and quotes out there indicate that about 2 out of 3 companies fairly regularly misidentify their high potentials, which is no small issue. As you can see, there's pretty serious consequences to doing that, one of which is Obviously, a misallocation of resources. Folks who are put in that program and stretched beyond or stretched in ways maybe they cannot handle may have difficulties maintaining their effectiveness and performance. If you're looking past the true high potentials and pulling in those who shouldn't be there, you run the risk of those true high potentials feeling frustrated, not necessarily overtly, but just feeling stymied in their growth and potentially losing them. And as you probably can trace the dots together and see, all those type of things can cause organizational performance to suffer. Some of the causes of misidentification are, one, just not using predictive assessments. Just again, we talked about performance being an evaluation of current performance. Those who fail to use anything else that would look at how someone could do in the roles and areas that are anticipated obviously are missing the mark right off the bat. Secondly is a lack of structure or clarity on what exactly we're looking for. So obviously there needs to be some shared mindset around what is the objective here and what are we aiming for. And then the third aspect that's pretty common is isolated data points and single points of opinion being the sole basis for some of these decisions. Again, a lot of times in companies that feel like they have a high potential program in place, if you ask them how they identify them, they say, well, we ask the managers who they think are high potentials. And again, not to beat up on managers because they're people like the rest of us and we're all subject to bias, but that quote I gave you at the beginning, that 90% of managers feel like they're the top 10% of performers. So obviously they may not be the most accurate assessors of performance and or potential. And this holds true in any assessment situation. Even myself as a psychologist who goes through regular executive assessments of others, I would be very uncomfortable basing an opinion on someone on one data mark that I obtained during that time. So it's important to have a convergence of factors that leads to a decision rather than just standing on one foot and hoping you're right. So what's the fix? How do we get past those errors and avoid misidentification? Well, I mean, obviously it's the opposite of what we just talked about. It's coming with a multi-source perspective, having more inputs than just one opinion. It's being somewhat structured so that there's consistency across the process, and Joe in Kansas City gets the same shake at being a high potential as Jane in New York. And so that there's some consistency on how we bring people in and folks have all crossed over the same height bar. Being objective to the degree possible. And certainly there are ways of doing that. It, again, does not mean dispensing with subjective assessment because that's important. And we'll talk about areas that we get some of that as well. And then integrating these results, and not just collecting single data points and leaving them sitting in their own bucket, but having a time and a method through which you're able to sit down and put together the picture that all these dots are creating. The fix in a more organizational sense is making sure that there is a shared mindset, that folks are on the same page in terms of what's the benefit of doing this, why do we need to do this, what are we aiming for, and how can we all contribute, and not just in checking the box type ways, but in a daily mindset type procedure. And then the last part is trying to ingrain this in standard organizational practices. And what I mean by that is not making this, to whatever extent possible, not making this a separate series of actions, but having it be woven into the fabric of what you're already doing. So, for instance, if we're already doing performance appraisals on a yearly basis, then also adding in some of the considerations of the factors that we're looking for in high potentials during that time. So that while we're looking at current performance, we're also looking at an individual's potential for future performance in various roles, and those two things become closely tied and more likely to stick. I put this in here as a good visual. It pertains to some of what we just talked about and things that we will continue talking about in slides to follow. But it's called the potential pyramid, and it's a good way of thinking about some of the processes that one might take in identifying high potential, and somewhat generic and maybe overly simplistic in some ways, but I think it can help us understand things. So obviously you start at the bottom with an individual and start thinking about whether the person really is committed and kind of on board with the company. And those are things that can be derived through observation. Again, the more observation, the better. But that's a starting point. And if the answer to that is no, obviously you're not moving forward with the assessment. But if the answer is no, it's time to consider, I would say more urgently, consider coaching. Consider what you need to do to kind of get that person on board, or if that's not possible, consider whether they need to be on the bus. The second, if it's yes in that bottom level, then the second question to ask is if the person's performance consistently exceeds expectations. Again, this is where that performance and potential overlap gets a little tricky. I will say that if the answer is no here, doesn't necessarily mean not move on. But it may mean consider, is the person in the right position? Are they being used to their full extent? Are they engaged and in the right seat on the bus? The next question then talks about, do the employee's actions, abilities, characteristics, whatever we want to say, do they align with the high potential indicators, which is a general term for those things that we as a company, by defining what our future state is and what's going to be needed to get there, does this person show signs of those? And that can be a variety of things. If I'm looking for a Major League Baseball player, I'm going to be looking for certain things like on-base percentage or whatever it may be. If I'm looking for the next CEO of our company that's heading into difficult times, I may be looking for courageous leadership. So it's all going to be contextual what that refers to. But that is a question that then allows you to kind of begin making those decisions around an individual who's high potential. And once they're at that top tier, that's the time to create that action plan for them to accelerate or kind of facilitate their readiness for advancement. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that in a second. All right. So assessing, the what's of assessing, what I would say is don't chase the shiny things. And what I mean by that is I think oftentimes folks have a tendency to zoom in on an individual's expertise or general intelligence level, which are obviously important. I'm not going to say that they are negatively correlated with potential, but if that's what you're focusing on, I would say it's a rather simplistic focus that may lead you into the wrong path. If you look at the research on general intelligence, for example, and the correlation between an IQ score and people's performance within their careers, most research, if you kind of boil it down, will point to IQ only having about a 4 to 10% influence on an individual's, the variability in an individual's performance. So obviously not the strongest indicator of performance, and we know performance is not exactly correlated with potential. What we are looking for in kind of a very basic fashion is an individual's flexibility and fit, if you ask me. So flexibility, one of those markers of that could be EQ or emotional intelligence, which most people are aware of. For those who are not, that's really refers to one's ability to recognize their own individual or other people's emotions, discriminate between their own feelings, label them, use that information to guide thinking and behavior. Second area that flexibility pertains to is the fluid intelligence, cognitive agility, however you want to say it. But what I'm contrasting that with is crystallized intelligence, which is a fancy word for that specific kind of retained knowledge that all that stuff great Jeopardy champions have, which is important to have some of that knowledge. But fluid intelligence is the capacity to think logically and solve problems in novel situations. So if we're looking at an individual and saying, well, Bob knows a ton about his area, well, that's great. But does Bob know how to think through the challenges that might arise when he steps up to the next seat? And that's the difference there. And it requires different assessments. I mean, it requires different ways of looking at a person, whether that's formal assessments of critical thinking, interview tactics that sometimes we use to unpack their decisions and how they've thought through things, or specific behavioral interviewing. There's a host of ways to get at that, but it definitely is a little different look than just that general cognitive ability. So flexibility and fit. The fit aspect, we already talked about being more specific in your definition of what potential we're looking for and what that means to us, so contextual considerations. And obviously that brings with it a consideration of the competencies that we're going to need, what's going to be most valuable to us in the future and in this position, as well as personal characteristics. So that may be aspects of personality or motivation or whatever contributes to their alignment or commitment to the potential opening that you're considering. This is a screenshot from our TQ assessment. And I put this on here as just kind of an example of how some companies have chosen to assess fit in real life ways. So as you look here, this is just a sampling. It's not the whole page, but it's each of those lines reflects an aspect of personality that is measured by our assessment. An individual can range from the low side to the high side, with there not being necessarily a good or bad connotation to either. And then you see the red triangle as where this fake individual scored. The green bars are what I want to zoom in on, though. And as you look above, you see that it says this is a Talent Quest manager. So suppose Talent Quest had gone throughout all their managers and taken an assessment of personality, and then looked at the top 10% or 20% of performers and said, what do these folks share in common? The result would be these green bars. These would be general areas that we normally would expect that our top performers will fall. And so this is going to vary by organization to organization, and that's what I mean by fit and how contextual it can be. For instance, if you look at the fifth line down there, subdued versus gregarious, and this individual ranging on the low end. You know, if we were assessing a manager of and I'm going to use kind of generic and probably inaccurate generalities here, but if we were looking for a manager of a library chain in a state organization, we may expect that that green bar is down around where that red triangle is, and maybe that person's right on target for what an effective library manager looks like. In contrast, if we're looking for a great manager who works on the street of Disney World, we're probably going to be looking at a green bar that's shifted to the right a little bit. And so our definition of what holds high potential for the position in mind is going to be different. So just an example, real life example of how folks can use software such as Talent Quest or other ways to assess that fit for future potential. The hows, we talked through this a little bit. I'm not going to beat this up too much, but obviously we want multimodal methods. And what I mean by that is if we're just basing our assessment of potential off of surveys or just off of interviews, we're losing the value we could have by doing both of those and or more. Standardized, we talked about real life, getting some feedback, and we'll touch on the 360s. That's one way of getting some real life feedback on things. We talked about the need to sit down and integrate all these thoughts into a cumulative whole, and starting simple if needed. And I will say even just coming up with a standardized list of questions around the values and competencies that you see in the next position is better than not doing that. So again, touching on, we talked before in a couple different sections about the relationship between past performance and future potential or performance. And I'll say that the way I look at it is kind of, I know this is a little overwhelming, that formula there at the bottom at first glance, but it's pretty simple. Past behavior, the best predictor is past behavior plus the objective assessments we talked about, and the integration of that assessment data with perceptions that are related to what we're really looking for. So again, don't dispense with a consideration of how an employee's doing, but tack onto that some objective assessments of their potential and those high potential indicators, and then sit down and put all that together. And that typically is the best way of going about business in this area. Talking through, once you have that group of people, then what? Obviously, a good place to start is identifying motivation, the individual, the high potential employee's motivation, and you should already have some of that information if you're doing a well-done assessment. That's important so that you know what the individual's drivers and desires are, and those need to be considered kind of simultaneously with your organizational needs, so that you have not only a sense of the target for the organization, but some of the pathways that you feel like the individual will experience as rewarding and motivating. So you develop a sense of various track options. Okay, so there's multiple paths to that end state, kind of choose your own adventure to get there. But it's important, and I bring this up because the best high potential programs are generally a consultative and collaborative process versus some sort of transactional dictate. I think there are all too often programs and ways of managing folks that are much in the vein of, if you do this for us, we will give you that. And what we know is that high potential employees tend to really enjoy being involved in planning their own development. If we're looking for these folks to take responsibility for the organization, yet we're not going to give them any say or responsibility in getting themselves to that place, it's somewhat of a double message here. Development fundamentals. So how do we go about developing these people? I would say the best starting place, and a place where you get a lot of bang for your buck, is just starting with increasing their insights. So that assessment that was done to bring them in provides valuable information that can really add to their development just in and of itself. And so with the organizations we work with, oftentimes after our developmental assessments, or not often, almost every time, we will sit down with that individual and then with the individual and their manager, and just talk through the findings. What are some of the strengths you have in terms of personality or interpersonal approach? What are some of the areas you can work on? And that not only gives an individual a sense of where they can begin leveraging strengths more effectively, but also sets them and their manager on the same page in terms of where are the places we're going to start working on. Setting expectations, clarifying targets, so letting that person know, and again, this may be in a direct sense or a more vague or less committed sense of what are we targeting, whether it's positionally or in terms of competencies or just general growth targets. And those need to be emphasized regularly. I mean, that should not just be a one-time-a-year type thing. That should be always on the surface, continually refreshed topic. Throughout the development process, there should be consistent and, again, multi-perspective feedback that's really targeted toward those things that you already discussed that were going to be the focus of growth. 360s are a great way of doing this, and here at Talent Quest we do a lot of that, rolling out 360s and doing that over the course of time for certain individuals to compare results and get ongoing feedback, and that's a very valuable tool. And then continual collaborative recalibration. And what I mean by that is not just making sure that we are assessing how progress is going, but we're also keeping a pulse on where the direction our company's heading, and making sure what we're targeting has not become somewhat outdated. Make sure that we're targeting the things that are needed over time. As far as the tactics for helping with development, obviously most of these are pretty common sense, but I think the first starting place is formal learning strategies, whether that's web-based trainings, learning management type activities, whether that's conferences or training events or readings. Formal learning strategies are things that are pretty commonly used. Secondly is delegating real responsibility and what I would call step-up invitations. An important consideration here is that there be real responsibility. And I think at times folks are given marching orders that may be a little bit above their pay grade. But the one thing that sometimes is lacking is the ability to really set their own direction in an area. And I think what that requires on the organization's part is some recognition that there's going to be it has to be an appropriate and reasonable space, but there has to be some ability to let that individual make mistakes. If we're going to just put them in the kiddie lane of the pool, they're never going to learn to take their feet off the bottom until they really need to, and that's not what this is all about. This is about helping them do that before they're in that role. Cross-functional assignments and teaming is another good strategy, not just for diversifying their knowledge and helping them grow, but sometimes it is a good way of interrupting their ascent. And what I mean by that is there is a tendency within the world of high potential employees to often promote to make sure we retain them, which is understandable, but it can be dangerous in that it puts people ahead of their learning curve and eventually sets them up for frustration or the organization for failure in some ways. So this can kind of be a pause on that upward trajectory by giving them something else to occupy their time, giving them something valuable to do. It's not just a wasted period of energy, but it's a way to not necessarily have to push them up to keep them engaged. Informal learning partnerships is what it sounds like, just partnering folks to allow for not only the transfer of knowledge, but also kind of observation of different styles. Fostering visibility at upward levels, so again, helping the high potential employee learn how to interact with those above them, as well as giving the folks who may eventually become their peers some understanding of that individual. And then coaching and mentorship, and we do that here at Talent Quest. I'm currently engaged with a pretty significant company at the senior vice president level, helping a group of 4 folks go through training to position them for the next step and help them be prepared. So coaching can be internal. It can involve folks like us. It can be more of a mentorship partnership, but it can be a very valuable tool for getting folks ready. Coming to a close here, I think it's important to consider how you're going to get buy-in on this. It's great to have all these ideas and to do all the legwork to get a program set up for success, but how are you going to get a program that's going to be used and become something that folks see value in? One thing I would encourage you to do is consider how to tie these things together in a comprehensive way rather than just rolling out singular pieces in a very haphazard manner over time. I think it's easier for all of us when we're given one thing to do than 5 different things, especially if those 5 different things don't seem related. So one way of considering how to do that is through software or database tracking. I think embedding the high potential identification in standard practices, like we talked about with performance review, can be one way of getting folks to do something without necessarily feeling like they're adding something totally new onto their plate. And then the software solutions, and I think there's probably a few out there. I'm most familiar, obviously, with ours. Can be a nice way to wrap it all together. And this is just a overview of the Talent Quest software solution. And obviously, as you look at this, it ties in a lot of the things we talked about, assessments, and I showed you a screenshot of that assessment. Goal setting, which not only are performance-based, which has some relevance to what we're discussing, but can also be developmental, and that can be much more relevant when it comes to high potentials. 360 surveys, we talked about the importance of doing that over time, and the nice thing about the Talent Quest software is that you can continue to track those and have a record of that. Learning, we talked about that as an aspect of development. Obviously, succession is highly relevant to what we're talking about here, and mapping out where people are and where they want to be. And then surveys can have some function in this domain. But regardless of the way you decide to approach it, those are the overviews of the rights and wrongs. I think there are at times, obviously, as I said, specifics that need to be decided by you based on your context, but there are obviously some areas where it makes sense to do things certain ways and not others. So hopefully this has been informative. I'm going to turn it back over to Dina for questions that may have come in.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Thank you for the presentation. We hope everyone has found it very useful. Please don't hesitate to email us with any questions. We did have a few questions. We will be emailing the presentation as well as a link to the recording out within the next 24 hours, so you will receive that directly in your email. And then we did have one question that came in. I'll read it to Brandon now. Someone did ask, what types of predictive assessments do you recommend?
Well, again, that's going to vary based on what we're looking for. I will tell you, in the coaching engagement I've just been involved with and still am involved with 4 senior vice presidents who are all moving upwards towards the highest peaks of their company. There's specific issues within the company, or considerations I would call it, regarding values and the way that people interact. And so a lot of emphasis was placed on emotional intelligence, personality styles, a fair degree of consideration of critical thinking for some of the problems that the company or challenges the company may be encountering as they continue on. So There are some general ones. I would say EQ and personality are two that I probably would not dispense with in any situation. But there certainly are more things that you could add on to that depending on the situation.
Which another question did just come in that kind of plays off of what you just answered, and it said, are there any specific EQ assessments that you deem effective?
Yeah, we use one called the EQI 2.0. It's a good self-report measure. There are some, emotional intelligence questionnaires vary in what they're measuring, whether it's a person's own assessment of how they stack up or actually putting them through the motions of assessing, what does this face show? What does that face show? Which is the actual ability in motion. We find that one to be a good one. It provides great information for the person who was assessed. If you're using it within an organization, it's a very usable end product that someone could learn how to give feedback on in a very short fashion. So it provides a lot of bang for the buck.
Thank you, Brandon. That does wrap up our questions for this afternoon. I want to thank everybody again for your time and your attention today, and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you all very much.